Hi, everybody. Welcome to .NET Microservices equals Megafun. I am Rachel Appel, and for today's webinar, we're going to have LaBrina Loving, a senior engineer at Microsoft, and she's going to demonstrate how to get started with microservices using great tools like Dapr and Project Tye, and also deploying to the cloud. So, about ready? Shall we go? LaBrina.
Yeah. Oh. Okay, so hello everyone. As Rachel mentioned, my name is LaBrina Loving. I'm a senior engineer at Microsoft. And so good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. Thank you all so much for joining. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about microservices in .NET and talk a little bit about how do you get started with microservices? How do you, some of the issues that you might run into with setting up microservices, and then using some tooling like Project Tye to actually simplify that. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. You guys ever? Yep. Okay. So for today, as I mentioned, I'm going to do just a quick refresher on microservices and kind of go through what are some of the problems that common developers might encounter when doing microservices. And then we'll talk about development with Tye. And then I'll show a little bit about microservices deployment. And then we'll go over some resources. Okay, so before I get started, what I really want to say to everyone is that I heart your monolith. So I know there's a lot of discussion out there in the tech world about monolith versus microservices. And what I would say to that is that if you have a monolith that's in production and it's running and it's amazing, then that's amazing. What I would say is that microservices is a new design pattern for making development a lot easier. But this is not saying that there's anything necessarily wrong with your monolith. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a microservices refresher. So, traditionally, we've been deploying using more of a monolithic design pattern. So basically, that means if you're a .NET developer, you've got a solution file, you've got a bunch of different projects, you've got your web front-end project, you might actually have a business tier, data access tier project, you've got a models, you might have a domain project for your models, and so on and so forth. But all of that is actually running in one giant solution project, and everyone on your development team is working together. It's stored in one repo. Everyone's working together on that repo. And more importantly, that entire thing gets deployed all together. So whether you have an API layer that has either 2 services or 2,000 services, you're, as a team, working on that together and deploying that all together. Well, that causes some problems, right? So one, when we move more to a microservice design pattern, all of those services can now be deployed, can now be developed and deployed separately. So as a developer, one of the things that's really cool for a development team is that oftentimes now you have development teams that have different backgrounds, and they choose to use different technologies to work together. So I might have a team that's building something more for data science and other things, and they're using Python. And then I might have another development team that's working on the API layer, and they're using .NET Core. And typically in a monolithic environment that poses challenges, but in a microservice environment that is very, very simple to do. And so, and then when we think about microservices, the ability to be able to deploy and do releases of that functionality independent of each other is really powerful. So for example, today, if I'm working in a monolith, let's say there's a one change to one of my APIs, there's a new feature request for that. And then there's another development team that's working on another feature that might be a little bit further out. Well, typically we have to schedule and we have to work together to get our features deployed together. But in a microservice architecture, we can actually work on those separately. We can deploy those separately. And then for me, as a cloud architect who works in the cloud every day, one of the things that is really exciting for me and really important for me with microservice architectures is that I can scale those microservices independent of each other. So meaning if I have a API service, let's say my get orders API, that get orders API probably gets called a ton of times. But some of my other APIs, some of the metadata APIs or whatever, may not get called as much. Well, if I deploy it in a monolithic application, I'm not able to scale those two APIs separately. But with microservices, I can absolutely deploy those separately. I can scale those separately. And I can very easily isolate points of failure should there be any. Okay, so with microservices, though, there are many benefits, but there are also many, many, many challenges. So I'm going to just go over a couple of those challenges. So let's think about a little bit about how do you get started with microservices today. There are many, many, many new tools that you have to learn. So you have to learn Docker. So if I create for every microservice that I create, I have to create a Docker file. I have to do things like Docker Compose. If I have multiple services that need to talk to each other, I have to learn Kubernetes because now I have to deploy and do orchestrations. There's Helm for deployment, and Istio, and really the set of tools and technologies that as a .NET developer, I have to learn and grow, really grows exponentially when I start deploying and building microservices at scale, especially when you kind of go beyond sort of your classic hello world type application. Oops. Yeah, let me get the next one. So as I talked about, we can use something like Docker Compose for some of these problems. Like Docker is easy. There are some really cool tools that I'll share in a little bit that are built into things like VS Code that makes somewhat building Docker files easy, but that only partially solves the problem. There's a really steep learning curve to get started. I mean, for myself, as a traditional .NET developer who started, who's been doing .NET development for 15 years or so, there's a lot of new tools out there. Not to say that is good or bad, but there's a steep learning curve. And also for a developer, traditionally, how do I debug these microservices across when they're communicating with each other? That's a challenge, right? So typically I could do something in Visual Studio where I might have multiple projects running together, but that over time becomes a little bit of a pain. So there are very, very, very many challenges to developing microservices today. Um, and that, as a .NET developer that was traditionally running monoliths, I didn't necessarily experience before. Okay, so what I want to do is introduce everyone to a new tool. If you were at Build, or if you actually attended the .NET conference last week, you might have heard a little bit about a new tool called Project Tye, or Tye. So Tye is a experimental project from the .NET team that really is aimed at simplifying development simplifying development of microservices. So essentially what Tye does is it allows things like service discovery. So you could actually build out, and I will be demoing these things. So you could actually build out all of your independent microservices and have them just in a folder. They're all independent projects. Tye will actually figure out, do service discovery using configuration conventions to showcase that. It understands how .NET Project files work. It creates really cool dashboards for logs and metrics, etc. It can run and figure out all of your Docker dependencies. And then it even can, through really just command line tools, you can Dockerize and deploy your services to AKS, to the Azure Kubernetes service. And then also it does like hot reload. So as services change, all of those things are sort of embedded into it. And so as a .NET developer, I kind of can continue doing .NET development that I know and that I'm very used to, and still be able to build and deploy microservices quite quickly. Okay. So to get started with Tye, what you have to do is you do need .NET Core 3.1. You could also, now that .NET 5 has been released, you actually can use .NET 5 as well. You need to install Docker Desktop, and then you need to install the Tye CLI, and I've got that set up for you. Okay, so without further ado, let me actually go into a demo that I'm going to show a little bit about how to get started with Tye. So let me bring up my Visual Studio. Oops. So what I've got is I've actually got set up here. I actually decided to set up a podcast application. So what I set out to do was actually wanted to set up a web application. I started doing a little bit of a podcast. So what I wanted to be able to do is set up a podcast application where people can come out to a website. They could see all of my podcasts. It's pretty much a pretty traditional, 3-tier architecture. So I've got I've got my DTC web application. I've got a service tier that sort of shows communication to my backend. So my backend is stored in Cosmos DB. So I'll just show a little bit of that. So let's start with my backend. So I've got configuration tier set up, Cosmos DB data service where I can pull just different things from my episodes from my backend. Then I've got just a models layer, just going to kind of describe what my episode looks like. And then some JSON property attributes that define that for serialization and deserialization. And then one thing that I actually chose to do, but you don't necessarily have to, is for my, because I deal and do a lot with Azure functions, I actually built my service layer with Azure functions, but there's nothing that would stop you from just also building just a web API tier as well, and deploying that. So here's just my get episodes function. I'm just doing some logging, and then here what happens is I'm just calling my episode service to get, and then returning a list of episodes. So pretty straightforward stuff. And then same thing if I just show my web. I've got some of that set up. So we'll talk a little bit about how this all works in a little bit. Okay, so first thing that I would want to do when I get started in using Project Tye. So as normal, I can start building and deploying solutions, building and deploying my solutions as I normally would. But then let's start now building out and getting ready to start deploying and developing locally with my project now. So what I do to get started is I just actually do Tye run. So there's two main commands that you want to actually use. So the first command is Tye init. And what that actually does is, and I'll show quickly here, is what Tye init does is it actually creates what's a YAML file. And it does that through service discovery and sort of conventions. So when I ran Tye.yam, I'll bring up my YAML file right now. When I ran Tye init, what actually happens is it builds a YAML file for me. I'll just show this briefly. So it built out this YAML file. So it built out a YAML file. That's not the one for mine. One second. So what it does is it builds out a YAML file for your solution. So let me bring that up very quick. One second. Didn't have everything set up yet. So while that's bringing up, so after we create our init file, here it is right here. So actually what it did, so here's my Tye.yaml file that after I ran Tye init, that it gets built. So what it actually does is it does some service discovery. So it figured out that I've got a couple of services. So it's figured out like here's DTC-web. Here's a service named DTC-web, and here's the C-Start project where it's located. It actually even figured out that I've got another service backend, and it actually through introspection figured out that it is in fact an Azure function. and then it figured out the location of that. So really simple. It just through command line, I can actually do that. So you can envision through your build process, I could over time, as new services get added, you just rerun Tye init as part of your build process, and it will recreate this YAML file going forward. Okay, so the next step in my process is I'm going to do Tye run. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So what's happening now is that it's doing some service discovery. It's actually going to start building, setting up and figuring out my dashboard. It's going to create a dashboard for me. It's building all my projects and doing all of the service discovery kind of underneath the covers. It actually creates this really cool dashboard. I'll show that. And you can actually see now what it's done. So it's gone in and set up my web and my backend processes. It's actually deployed and set them up on a port. So now I don't have to worry about any kind of like port conflicts and all of that. And it tells me it's listening to different events. So let's go ahead and show this. And I'll go ahead and show this dashboard. So here's my dashboard. So imagine now I've got my DTC web, I've got my backend function that's being run. It's got some, it shows the replicas. It's got a really nice logging feature where I actually can view and see logs. I'll actually go back there. We'll show that in a minute. But let's go ahead and click on my my website. So just while that's coming up, sorry, my thing's not charging. So this is actually just my quick and dirty web application that's communicating to my backend service. So just pulled a set of my episodes from my backend. So really super simple. I can actually look into my logs here. It shows like all of the requests that got handled. I can look in the logs for my, I can look into the logs for my function. It even shows all of the calls here. So you could see like it's calling them a Cosmos DB service, data service, and all of those things. All right. And everything that happens. So really, really, really very simple to get set up. I just use all of the things that I normally would do, and I'm able to set up and debug my web application pretty easily, and with all the backend and front end services working and communicating together. One thing that I wanted to just quickly comment about this. So here, I've set up, here is my call to get my episodes just set up. One thing that I want to just call attention to is that I don't have any hard-coded URL for my backend service. What I've actually done is set up this config client, which I'll show that, the config client, and then there's this get service URI extent, and that's calling my backend. So that means that basically I've actually kind of, instead of through service discovery, and I can actually make a call to all of my backend services, name them, and it's just using the naming conventions. So pretty simple to actually call and debug my services between each other, because now I'm just using their names. I don't have to use the URLs. I don't have to, figure out where to find them and all of that kind of thing. So I can work with them independently and find them just using their names. So as I said, service discovery, very, very, very simple. A couple of other things a couple of other examples that I just wanted to show before we talk a little bit more about kind of drilling into microservices. So let's say, for example, I also wanted to do something around Redis cache. So I wanted to use Redis cache instead of in as part of my application to keep going. So what I can do is I can actually go back into my YAML file, and I'll just show a quick example of this. So I'll just show another example of how I would make that work. So let me just bring that up real quick. Okay. So what I could do, wait for a second. Sorry, my machine's like going super slow right now. Okay. So what I would do is, let's say if I wanted to add Redis cache. So I could actually just, inside of my YAML file that I have set up, I could go ahead and add a new service called Redis, set up the bindings, set up the connection string, and then I'm also going to add another service called Redis-CLI. When I do that, it again, actually Tye knows how to pull this down, pull down the images for me, set up that container, because I don't really want to have to deal with adding additional dependencies. So I can actually add this as a container image as part of my YAML file, and then Tye knows how to get that. And then again, just start building and developing against that. One other thing that I wanted to just show. So same thing. If I wanted to also use something like Dapr, I'll just show quickly kind of what that YAML file does. This is another YAML file that I've just put together and shown. So now I've got this is a different application, but I've set up my project name. Here are my services that I've got set up. And then I've added Redis cache as a dependency. And then I've set up a Dapr image and done Dapr IO. And then I'm pointing to this placement argument. And then so here I can actually set up Dapr and placement container and run that within all of my ports. Okay, cool. So one of the last things before we kind of keep going is, well, actually, let's talk a little bit about, let's go back and talk a little bit about serverless and talk about containers and deployment of microservices. All right. So a lot of times when we start thinking about deployment of microservices, one of the big questions that always comes up is, should I use serverless technologies or should I use containers? And the question is, and the answer is like, in theory, you can use both, right? It's not an either or, it's really a both. So containers are typically good for migrating legacy type applications. So if you've already implemented some batch processes and other things that are already running and already set up, and let's say that now you want to incorporate those now into your microservices, that's where I might think about containerizing. It also, as I kind of showed in the demo as well, like third-party things that I want to incorporate into my application, I can use containers to containerize that service. So Redis Cache, MongoDB, RabbitMQ, Elasticsearch, all of those things, all of those kind of third-party services that are part of that I want to be part of my core ecosystem of my application, but I don't want to have to worry about building and incorporating them. That's where I can bring in containers. When I think about serverless, so serverless technologies really, in terms of microservices, really help around that. When we talk about things like independent scaling, when we talk about things like event-driven architecture. So let's say that I have a service that I want to have run every time a message gets put on a queue. So I can use things like serverless technologies in the cloud to be able to message gets put on a queue, that service wakes up, it does something, and then it goes back to sleep. So that's kind of the beauty of serverless platforms, is that it actually gives us this kind of scale, sort of start and stop capability very easily. And they could be easily discarded, started, rewritten, and adapted over time. So, for me, it's an extremely, because I'm pretty cheap, it's a pretty low cost way of running servers in the cloud by using serverless technologies like Azure Functions. Okay. So just kind of wanted to show at a high level, I talked a little bit about before, kind of looking at the code that I had written for my podcast solution. So this is actually sort of what that architecture might look like if it was when it gets deployed in the cloud. So when we think about deploying microservices to the cloud, one of the things that we have to think about is your services get deployed and managed through what's called a container registry. So you can think of container registries as kind of your library. So I've got a library of services. I've got a configuration file that describes what that service looks like. And then I can pull and push. I can push new versions of that server. I can push new versions of that service to my container registry and then pull that service into Kubernetes. So that's the first thing. And then I've got, I could have a host of services that are running in Azure Kubernetes service. I could also have them front loaded with something like API management that might manage something like that might manage something like all of my services, but also provides me a lot smoother and better developer experience for external developers who might be pulling in those APIs. Or also I can use something like API management to manage authorization very easily, so I can manage across all of my various services, who has access to those services, who doesn't have access to those services, and things like that. And then I have kind of these cross-cutting concerns, which actually I could run. These are native services like Key Vault, Azure Monitor for monitoring your application, and application insights for doing more application performance type of solutions. But there's nothing, as we talked about before, from if I want to use other open source technologies. So I have a number of customers that are using something like Elasticsearch for logging and monitoring their applications. And they're actually there's a very nice container for Elasticsearch. I can put that container in my Azure Container Registry and deploy that and have that be part of my Kubernetes cluster. So the thing about these kinds of architectures is that it gives you a lot of, I think in technology, we started overusing the term of puzzle pieces, but I will, at the risk of sounding cliche, reuse that term. But at the end, say that it is very easy, because now you kind of start thinking about these sort of singular, smaller services that get deployed independently. And I could easily have both these third-party services like Redis and RabbitMQ, Elasticsearch, working directly with my .NET Core application, and not too much, and not really have too much of issue. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about deployment of my microservices. So there's actually just a couple of steps if I wanted to deploy my .NET Core microservices into Azure. So as I kind of mentioned before, first step one is I'm going to create a container registry. Step two is I'm going to create an AKS cluster. And I'll actually provide some links about how to do that and then I just run Tye deploy -- interactive. So let's see here. So I'm going to just go into my portal, because I've already got some of this already set up. And I'll just kind of walk through. I've actually already set up my Azure Container Registry. And I've actually also set up my AKS cluster. So I'll just show kind of quickly what that looks like. And for those of you who aren't too familiar, I always forget, like I literally work in Azure every single day. Probably less now than I work in Visual Studio. So here's so this is my Azure portal. I can go into portal.azure.com. I feel like that looks small. Fine. So here is my couple of things. I've got a Kubernetes AKS cluster set up. Haven't yet deployed anything to it, but just some information about it. And then I've also set up a container registry. So I've got a container registry already set up. You could actually look, I've deployed a couple of things just to deploy. But as I mentioned before, you can think of your container registry as sort of your library of services that are available for you to push and pull things into. All right, so now what I want to do is, let's see. So now what I'm going to do is do Tye deploy. And I was having a little bit of issue, so we'll see if this will work well. When I run Tye deploy -- interactive, what it's starting to do is set up my kube control. And kube control is a command line tool that's used for managing your Kubernetes clusters. So it's asking me now for my ACR, my Azure Container Registry. So let's see if I can add that up. So yeah, so this is my container registry. And so now what it's actually doing, and so there is right now with Azure Functions, we don't actually have complete integration to do complete deployment, but you can see sort of some of the things that it's starting to do. Yeah, because it's not able to push everything because of my Azure function and because of a couple of things. But you could see fully that it's starting to build my Docker image, and it created it. It wasn't able to push it out because I made it a private registry. So you could see it built my Docker image. It would have pushed it out into that container registry and then deployed it into AKS. As a .NET developer, this is like super simple and super awesome for me because again, all I had to do was build my code the way that I normally do it, and then install Project Tye, and then run a few commands to get everything set up. I build out my YAML file, build out my Docker build out my Docker files, push those out to a registry, and I'm up and running. So I feel like one of the big things typically that's starting to happen with development, especially with Kubernetes, is that you now have developers who now are having to get more and more back into kind of managing Kubernetes clusters and having to figure out all of the tooling and things around that. And so now I think one of the things I really like about Project Tye is that it again kind of separates the kind of the development from the infrastructure in a much cleaner way. Okay, so let's go back to I know we've got like 15 minutes left, so I got like a couple of slides, and then I see a bunch of questions, or maybe not, in the chat. So we can go through those questions as well. All right, cool. Actually, I just wanted to check one thing really quick before we do that. Just check to see if my that pushed out to my registry, but maybe it didn't. Yeah, no, it didn't. Okay. So anyway, so all right. So let's just, again, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about how microservice communications kind of work, sort of underneath the covers. So there's sort of two main approaches for communicating in microservices. So one is kind of this direct client to microservice communication. So let's say I have my web application that's in .NET or mobile app that's written in Xamarin or whatever we have. I can go from my web application into microservices, and I'm kind of directly communicating. More often than not, what is probably the more elegant way to do that is to have some kind of gateway, or it's called an API gateway, that's kind of in the middle, that's managing these microservices. So I think I showed that a little bit earlier, where you'd have something like API management that would show kind of, your .NET Core application that's calling, that's sort of first kind of meeting this API management or API gateway, and then that's sort of managing communication to the microservices. The reason why that's really, really, really important is because it actually kind of manages everything communication there. We could also add things like Dapr, which will manage what we call east to west communication. Well, in my thing, it's actually north to south, but basically using Dapr to manage communication between the microservices, and then using some kind of API gateway layer to manage communication into the client, from your client or your front end into your back end. Okay. So what I wanted to do is just in terms of resources, there's tons of resources for getting started. I'll kind of go through the Project Tye GitHub repo just to get everyone familiar with it. If you're interested in functions or API management, totally. Here's some additional examples. Here's a couple of other examples around like using serverless. This is one that my team built. There's also, if you're really new to microservices, I didn't put this, but I can share it as well. But there's some really good Learn modules on the Microsoft site. So you can go aka.ms/learn. And if you type things like microservices, there's a lot of really good self-paced Learn modules. I've actually gone through a ton of them myself over the last year to help myself get started. So I just wanted to show before last thing is just the GitHub for Project Tye. Let's just bring up here. So when you go out to the Project Tye website, and you go out to, so there's a bunch of samples. So they've actually even added a bunch more now. So there's the couple that I showed you, but there's a ton. If you're for different front ends, there's a ton that kind of show like ingress controllers, and even one like for Mongo, which is cool. And then there is if you check out the docs section, so this is actually where you can go to kind of get started with everything. And then there's a bunch of tutorials and recipes. So using Dapr with Tye, the AKS and GitHub Actions. So that's a really cool one. If we had more time, I would have showed that. So basically, if you're using GitHub Actions or whatever you're using, or whatever you're using for deployment, you can actually now do kind of a complete CI/CD deployment. So as soon as you do like and incorporate that Tye deploy command line. So highly recommend everyone to go ahead and check this out if you want to get started. Here's some information about the command line reference and some of the other things that talk about like service discovery and local development. Okay. Oops. So I think those are all the slides that I had. Again, if you want to reach out to me or you have more questions, feel free. I'm at Chicks Can Code on Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions or you're excited or want to learn more. I'm actually going to be deploying out that podcast architecture. The whole solution will be on my GitHub site, which is also github.com/chickscancode. So that is it for me. I think there are how I see a bunch of questions.
Yes. So thanks again, LaBrina. Yes, let's get to some of those questions.
Okay.
There's a couple of very good ones that came through. Nice, meaty questions.
Yeah. Okay.
So first one is, well, all right, how can I start with a question? So this is such a broad topic. It's microservices, but like you said, you have, Docker and Kubernetes and Azure and cloud things and all these moving parts. So how long reasonably could it take for somebody going like 0 to maybe not super expert, but hey, not too bad, if that's a good grade?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I would definitely start with a foundation. So, and I could probably add some more information on that. But as I kind of mentioned, start with you could either go out to aka.ms learn and start with we've got a couple of really good modules on getting started with microservices. So, and it's all like a really nice self-contained environment. So I would say you like any learning, like build the foundation. So you want to build a foundation around, what is Docker? How do I spell it? How do I get familiar with it, deploying it, all that stuff. Then you want to build a kind of layer on, first understanding microservices, first foundation, next foundation, I would say Docker, and then third foundation, AKS or Kubernetes, sorry, just Kubernetes. But that's why I was really excited about Tye, because I think for me, I like I said, I've been a .NET developer for 15 years plus. And so I was also too overwhelmed. So you're among friends if you're feeling overwhelmed. So I too was overwhelmed. And I feel like this was a good kind of gateway because I did those fundamental sort of classes or trainings online with, Docker and Kubernetes, but then I still felt like, wow, I still feel a little bit overwhelmed. And I feel like with Project Tye, now I can kind of see what's happening. It's building. Sometimes when those files and all that stuff get the tooling happens, it gives you a better way to sort of reverse engineer, which I don't know if some people, I'm a reverse engineer person. So that's like, I reverse engineer my way into learning. So I feel like my learning got accelerated, and then I was able, now like put some pieces together, and then now I'm like off to the races with Kubernetes and some other things. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I get the reverse engineering thing. Sometimes taking something apart and then putting it back together is the best way.
Yeah.
So here's one from Sam Bav. When should we not use microservices, or what are the disadvantages of the microservice design pattern?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I would say definitely some of the things that I talked about, definitely not every application needs to be use a microservice architecture. So think about the types of things that the types of applications, like famous applications that are using microservice architectures. I'll pick the two that are famous, like Netflix and Amazon, right? So one of the reasons why it's really important is because they're processing a lot of transactions. It's very huge, and they have a huge development team that's deploying things independently, right? And so that's one great reason, right? Even if you're a much smaller development team, think about those things such as, we want to be able to deploy things at separate time scales, right? So I've got one piece of the application one small team that's working on one piece of the application, another small team that's working on another piece. I don't want to have to make those two teams. I want to be able to allow those two teams to work independently and deploy their code at whatever fashion they want to. The other thing that I would definitely say, as more applications become, I work with customers all the time, and they were basically born in the cloud. Like, they know nothing about VMs. And so for them, it's super important. They want to take full advantage of the cloud as soon as they are able to. And being able to take full advantage of the cloud means that you're able to deploy things that can scale up and that can scale down very easily. And when you use microservice architectures, that really allows you to take advantage of that. But I also have customers, they have much older applications, and they're still deploying to the cloud, but it may not make sense, right? Like, if you have an application, and that's why I started my first slide, like, I love your monolith, because if you've had an application that's been around for many, many years, it may not make sense to automatically go ahead and rewrite it to all of these microservices. Or maybe it might make sense to start from there. You can do something like containerize it. So just take your monolith, put it in a giant container. So that way you got some advantages. And then over time, if you feel like it's right, you can go to microservices.
Yeah. Okay. One other good beefy question here from Azat.
Yep.
Yes, I have felt this pain before, my friend. So how do you persuade the team to start implementing microservices? I don't mean to rewrite everything from scratch at once, but at least recognize the problem and stop increasing the size of the monolith. Yes, I do feel your pain there.
I know. Yeah, I think really, so it sort of depends on who on your team you're speaking to, right? So there's sometimes can be a cost savings immediately with microservices. So whoever's in charge of the purse strings, you can have that conversation about, hey, if we're able, like the example that I gave, where think about if you've got 15 services that are deployed in a monolith, and it's deployed to this huge VM. And maybe only 2 of those services out of those 15 really ever get called constantly. Well, but you still have to pay for all of that. So thinking about microservices in terms of that way, I can pay for what I use when I use it. So one, the cost savings. 2, I think some of those arguments about we can't I hear this all the time from development teams. We can't go any faster because we're dependent on, this other piece, and they're in the middle of a release cycle. And so some of those kinds of things can go away if you get down to the smallest piece service and say, hey, I only need to really make it this one service is independent of everything else. I only need to make a change to this one piece, and now I can go fast. As soon as I get the fix in, I've done all my unit tests, all your unit tests pass. Then I can, start getting that deployed out to test environments rather than having to work through. I've got to wait for, I've got to wait for Rachel's piece and this other piece, and all these things. Like, you can go. I see development teams being able to go much faster. And the other thing that I actually really like too is the argument of now we can truly all code harmoniously in the language that we like, or that we all kind of agree, because different programming languages are geared and better for different types of things that you're building. Like I totally see with all the Python libraries and around like more data science type things, that being a better service. So as I've worked on applications where we had that, and Python was better, and Python was maybe better for that, and that was fine. I didn't necessarily have to make the Python developers learn .NET, and I didn't have to learn Python. I mean, I know Python a little bit, but I didn't have to learn Python extensively. We could all, work together and build the solution the way that it best fits. So I think it allows development teams to start thinking more like best in breed, or however that goes, than like sort of everyone conforming to .NET or everyone conforming to Java or whatever you want to do. I saw there was a Java question. So Java, I can't remember where it was, but yes, totally. You could use the same approach with Java, whatever programming language. This would work.
Yeah, I think that was basically at the Java one, was like, what's basically the difference between .NET and Java, but conceptually they're the same.
Yeah.
Right? As far as the big picture, and the real differences are just those little details and syntaxes and things. So, okay. One last question came in. Oh, this is another good one from Saramet. Can the vertical slice architecture pattern be considered a solution for moving a monolith towards microservices while implementing client new features?
Yeah, that can be. There's another pattern that I've used. Just like look at it really quickly. I've worked with a couple of customers on. It's called a strangler pattern. Which is kind of similar. No, I'm not sharing it yet. Let me just bring it up real quick. But it's another pattern. So I would look at both of those as a way to do exactly what you're talking about. So basically, slowly move your monolith to into microservices, and then sort of you've got kind of this fork in the ground where everything new is going to go to microservices pattern, and then you're slowly kind of moving over your monolith into microservices, or maybe not. Like, I mean, you could also still just keep your monolith and maybe just put it in a giant container, and then everything going forward works in microservices. So I would look at that, and it's called a strangler pattern.
That sounds very forceful. I
know it does.
Well, I can't say I've used that one myself. So, okay. Well, I think we got through all of the questions. So again, I would like to thank you for joining us, and everybody. This was recorded, so it'll show up on JetBrains TV on YouTube, and there are some links with more information, including LaBrina's Twitter. So you can all go ask her questions there and, have some nice chats about microservices and all of that good stuff. And it's at Chickscan Code. And thanks everybody for joining.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.